Welcome to IIEA Insights with me, Dan. Europe's economy has suffered shock after shock since the very first months of this decade. Pandemic, lockdowns, inflation, war, and energy crisis, and big and rapid increases in interest rates could have caused a depression. One could argue, and I certainly do, that to have merely stagnated and kept unemployment low is a remarkably good outcome, all things considered. Yet when we compare ourselves on this side of the Atlantic to the United States, as we in Europe have always tended to do, the performance looks less good. In this edition of Insights, we're going to look at EU-level economic policy choices, fiscal, monetary, and international trade that are now being faced. We'll discuss both the pure economics of these issues and how they affect Ireland in particular, as well as the politics, something which can never be ignored in a bloc of 27 sovereign countries and a currency union of 20. To explore these issues, I'd like to welcome Lucinda Creighton, CEO of Vulcan Consulting and former Europe Minister, and Conall Coille, Chief Economist of Bank of Ireland and a former central banker at the Bank of England. Welcome to you both. Let's start with the rules on government spending and tax in the member states. These have caused endless disagreements and controversy. Some might recall Ireland's spat with Brussels during Charlie McCreevy's time as finance minister more than 20 years ago. The rules have been tweaked a number of times and they have been changed again this year. Lucinda, can I come to you to start with the politics of all of this? Are the divisions among the member states, north, south, usually the same as ever? How much political capital was put into these negotiations? Do the member states really take them that seriously anymore? And where does Ireland stand? Are we part of the frugal north or the more free spending south these days?
Great intro, and lots to sort of chew on. I suppose the new rules are an attempt, I suppose, to be a little bit more flexible than previously, while at the same time reining in spending and deficits and debt, which has obviously accumulated, as you've alluded to, particularly throughout the COVID pandemic. And yes, it has caused division, and that is always the case. And I suppose it's always a bit interesting to see at European level how these divides manifest, not so much on party political ideological grounds, but more on geographical grounds. And that's always the case. I mean, you can often say when it comes to these kind of debates at European level, you know, a Danish socialist will be much more conservative than you know, a Christian Democrat or conservative from one of the southern countries, and I think that still holds. If anything, you're beginning to see an even greater flexing of the sort of conservative or, you know, fiscally restrained perspectives of some of the countries that are always of that persuasion, but are maybe becoming a bit more vocal. So obviously you have a new government in the Netherlands, underpinned by Geert Wilders, and that government, the Dutch, are always you know, keen to restrain spending, to keep debt levels low, and to not sort of bail out other member states, and that I think is even more pronounced now. At the same time, the Germans, which, you know, of course, Germany is led by a social democratic chancellor, and they have, I think, in terms of rhetoric, been a little bit more free flowing and maybe slightly less on that fiscal rectitude path, as the CDU-led governments would have been through the financial crisis, obviously, and since then. But we're seeing even a change in tone from Berlin now as well. So the Social Democrats, they have their own domestic sort of financial crisis. Maybe crisis is too strong, but definitely concerns about mounting debt, etc., and challenges around economic reforms, and so the Germans are very much now back at the forefront of calling for, you know, putting back in place these types of rules, and you know, while linking them to future investment and making certain caveats or flexibilities that weren't there under the old Stability and Growth Pact, it's still back to trying to contain debt and trying to ensure that everybody is what the old Charlie Haughey phrase, living well, an inverse of the Charlie Haughey phrase of living within their means as opposed to living beyond their means. So I think it's interesting, but there are different dynamics now as well, because Greece has actually become a bit of a model child, still has huge debt, but compared to where it was, has been very successful at reducing its debt levels over the last number of years. Other countries could certainly take a leaf out of the sort of structural reforms book that the Greek government has been pursuing. So the dynamics are not all the same as they were 10 or 15 years ago, but there is nuance. But ultimately, yes, the North is more concerned with constraint and restraint, and the South is more flehulik, as we'd say in this country.
And just one issue arises there. You mentioned the current German Chancellor. If we go back 10 years, Germany was viewed as the powerhouse economy. Chancellor Angela Merkel was viewed as the clear leader in terms of Europe. Things have changed a lot for Germany.
Yeah.
The current Chancellor doesn't have the authority she had, and the German economy is suffering some big structural changes. Has that changed the degree of influence the Germans have, and have the French benefited from that?
Yeah, look, the Germans are and will always be the biggest and most important member state. Well, until perhaps the next round of enlargement, if it ever happens. But certainly the leadership of Merkel has not in any way been emulated by Schulz. That's we've seen it on Ukraine, and we've seen it through the pandemic, and now on these tougher economic governance discussions. That's partly because his position in Germany is not as strong as hers was, and partly because dynamics have changed at European level as well, and just personality. Merkel was an imposing figure in a kind of in that sort of motherly sort of fashion. She commanded the room at the European Council, and everybody wanted a piece of her, and everybody wanted nearly, her to pat them on the head. So that has completely changed. Macron, I think the expectation was that he would step into the breach as a kind of the senior figure at the council meetings, at the heads of state and government. He has tried in a sense, but I think with very limited success, to be honest. I mean, the problem for Macron is that he's the boy who has cried wolf 1,000 times. He has failed miserably with so many of his own economic reforms domestically, and he's now, on his last lap in essence, and the discussion in Paris is about who's going to replace him. So he had an opportunity. He talked a good game, but I think a characteristic of Macron, I like him. I would agree with an awful lot of his sort of stated economic and political agenda, but in terms of his implementation, I think it's been poor, and that it's reflected in terms of how he's regarded on the European stage.
And finally, just for this opening round, where's Ireland in this? Are we sort of halfway between the North and the South, or have you seen a change in our position in terms of supporting tighter rules, or being more flehulik, as you say?
Everything changes, So I mean, Ireland, we were in the call for Euro bonds back in the day. We were, when we were sort of on our knees, we wanted every assistance from Europe, and we wanted flexibility on all counts. Of course, now we are a net contributor to the EU budget. We are, one of the wealthiest countries, not just in Europe, but in the world. And so, tighter fiscal rules suit us, and I think that's reflected in the position of Ireland. So we have a pretty conservative stance on all this stuff now, which maybe wasn't the case when we were in the doldrums back in from 2010 on.
Right. Thanks for those very insightful remarks. Conall, looking at the change of the fiscal rules, are they more growth friendly? I suppose a big criticism of the rules over the years is that they were not growth friendly, particularly in times of downturn. So what's your assessment of them in terms of growth friendliness? And you've also identified a new expenditure rule that says that countries will have to commit to a 5-year time frame on how much they're going to increase their spending. If they want to exceed that, they're going to have to increase taxes to do so. So it doesn't constrain how much governments can spend, but it does say that if you want to spend more than you've committed to, you need to raise taxes. What does that mean for Ireland?
Well, if we start with the actual rules themselves, the main targets from the Stability and Growth Pact 20 years ago when the euro was created, which is at 3% of GDP deficit, you have to be inside that, and also reduce your debt to 60% of GDP. Well, they're still there. And I suppose there'll be a bit of criticism from the economics community. Those have been reassessed. The 60% of GDP makes sense today. What's the rationale for that? There wasn't a great deal of rationale 20 years ago or 25 years ago. But those are still there. But what has changed is that if you're outside of those, and clearly Ireland is well inside them, so this won't be applying to us, the adjustment path to bring your deficit down, bring your debt down has changed. So this is clearly a negotiation between the Northern and Southern European countries. We don't have a kind of one-size-fits-all adjustment path now to get inside these deficit and debt criteria. The original Stability and Growth Pact said if you take that 6% of GDP, take 1/20th of the gap, or 5% of the gap, if you like, between 6% of GDP and wherever you might be, if you're over 100, and you need to reduce your debt by that amount per annum. So that's gone. And instead, you're going to have what they call, I suppose, an adjustment path agreed with the European Commission. That can be, 4 years, maybe perhaps even extended to 7 years, if you're making the requisite investments and reforms, and the Commission agree with that. And also it'll be assessed once you start to adjust towards meeting those targets, that people look at what they call net expenditure, which is deducting interest payments, deducting unemployment benefits, so allowing a bit of extra flexibility there. And also trying to move away from what we call the structural budget balance, which is very difficult to measure. And we never see it, and we can never verify if we're entirely right. It's always an estimate. So again, I think that was sort of seen as opaque, and we're kind of looking at this net expenditure rule. So again, a lot more flexibility for countries that do need to reduce their debt to do so. And, that's a big change from the Stability and Growth Pact. However, there are safeguards. If you're one of those countries whose debt is over 90% of GDP, by the end of the 4 years, you are expected to reduce your debt GDP ratio by at least 1 percentage point per annum. So again, there are some safeguards in Northern European countries that, these adjustment plans do have to work, and they do have to have the sort of minimum reduction in debt levels. But overall, standing back from all this, you kind of ask, they're less strict, the more flexible rules, but how effective were the rules in the first place? We've seen plenty of countries exceed 3% of GDP. We are where we are. We clearly exceeded these metrics, or we sort of suspended the rules, if you like, during the COVID-19 pandemic. So these rules have been kind of honoured in the breach rather than adhered to. So now we have a more flexible set, which perhaps was more successful, or be more successful in terms of being adhered to. Just in terms of Ireland, I was quite struck by the Department of Finance's stability programme update, where they had a box on the new rules. Now, look, we'll be well inside those targets.
So, Conall, can I just interject and just say the Stability Pact update is something all governments have to do in April of each year. It includes a whole range of budgetary and economic forecasts. So they do those, and every government does those in April before they do their budgets at the end of the year. Just to let people know what the SBU is.
Yeah, so even though we're running a surplus, our debt GDP ratio is around 40%. We will still have to, for the first time in September this year, submit a 5-year plan for net expenditure. And the department itself, in its latest publication, has called this a sea change in budgetary policy. We're going to have a very careful assessment of the macroeconomic outlook, but also the spending pressures over the medium term. And anyone who's read the sort of commentary by the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, or just follows the budgetary debate, will know that we've had very large spending overruns, which have been kind of met by overshooting corporate taxes over the past couple of years. And, to some extent, that's alleviated the pressure. We've avoided difficult questions on personal taxation because corporate taxes have been so buoyant. But that's unlikely to be the case over the next 5 years. If you look at our spending projections, we don't index things like tax bands or social welfare payments to inflation. If you look at, the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council would say that the standstill costs, just providing the same real level of public services, particularly in health, are probably higher than the Department of Finance are factoring in. As well as that, the Department of Finance assume a kind of a no policy change basis for a lot of their projections on spending. So to move towards this 5-year plan, where we set out a kind of a set of spending projections we intend to stick to, would be a very large change. In fact, the past 5 years, we clearly haven't done that. So I suppose the question is, will we inevitably deviate from whatever 5-year plan we come up with? And there really isn't that much the Commission has in the way of censure or to kind of, will this just something just inevitably happens? But at least the intention at face value within the new rules is that we set out a 5-year plan for net spending and we stick to it. That will certainly be, in the Department of Finance's own words, a sea change in how we do budgetary policy.
And in terms of the rules, are they adjusted in any way for population change? Clearly, Ireland's had a really big increase in population. Particularly, we've been continue to draw in workers. We've had the Ukraine crisis and a growing number of non-Ukrainian asylum seekers. That's had a big impact on the population, a really big impact. Any adjustment for per capita changes there in those rules?
Well, there will be, in the sense that the Commission is going to look at each country individually, and what everyone is in their mind's eye is really Italy here. But the question is, when they look at an individual country, they're looking at trends in productivity growth, population growth, and taking that kind of trend GDP growth rate into account in terms of the adjustment plan, assessing whether the investments or reforms are going to be sufficient to help boost growth and help that fiscal adjustment. So again, you're correct. I mean, we've seen enormous increases in the population. I mean, the official numbers had almost 100,000 extra people in the year to April last year. So that's, almost 2% growth in the population. So that kind of just adds to the challenge of setting out a 5-year expenditure plan. And I could well imagine if in a year's time, there's greater demands on, the range of public services and social welfare payments, and that's due to unanticipated migration, that's going to be something which I suspect the Commission will just have to accept and, will be used as a reason that we may have deviated. But again, it goes far beyond just population growth. We have debate around the standstill costs of, the Fiscal Advisory Council saying the department has underestimated the standstill costs of providing healthcare. So that there's a range of reasons why spending could deviate. Population growth is just one of them.
And tell me, in 5 years from now, do you think we're going to come back again and there's going to be further pressure to revise these rules as there so often has been over the past 25 years?
Well, look, I think there's also the issue of kind of the EU's fiscal capacity. The Recovery and Resilience Fund, which may come on to, was kind of the first stab at that. Does that need to grow? Interest rates have increased, in fairness, and all of those fears around the Italian debt position haven't come to fruition. So there's always sort of in the background fears of kind of fragmentation of the euro area. Interest rates have increased. We've seen the progress with Greece. Lucinda mentioned Italy. That issue around Italian debt hasn't reared its head. So, there are a lot of people forecasting the end of the euro about 10 years ago. I think the euro has proved a lot more resilient. But look, I think there's been a movable feast. But the next issue will be the Recovery and Resilience Fund has to be paid for. And there's going to be a debate for the next EU budget round between the contributors and the people receiving. So that's going to make that budget debate all the more fractious, and I'm sure that will feed into the rules as well.
Lucinda, during the early months of the pandemic, the fractiousness of that debate became probably the most intense it's ever been, where the Southerners were calling for an increased fiscal capacity, Northerners were wary, and happened, and it was often called a Hamiltonian moment as common debt issuance in the United States in the early years of that republic led to the creation of the modern US state. In hindsight, how significant do you think the Resilience Fund has been for European politics, or has it all just sort of faded away and just become a sort of an afterthought, or to some extent memory hold, a bit like the pandemic itself?
So I think that the predictions, a little bit like the predictions that the euro was going to implode and the European Union was going to break up. If you recall, I mean, it was a little bit over the top during the financial crisis. I think maybe the effect of joint borrowing during and pooled debt during the COVID pandemic, the sort of the trigger that was projected to be for deeper political integration and a greater emphasis on common bond issuance and all the rest of it, it hasn't really transpired. And actually, I think Conall is absolutely right. Like the big question now is, well, well, actually, there are two questions. One is, how is it all going to be paid for? I mean, it's kind of ironic when we have these protracted debates within the EU institutions about mounting debt being accrued by member states, when actually the European Union has been accruing debt at an extraordinary level over the last number of years, without any kind of obvious or clearly thought through way to pay for it. I mean, there's talk of top ups being contributed by member states, and the second factor that I mentioned is that so little of it has actually sort of been spent. So there's a kind of a financial management issue in the EU context as well that I think we can't overlook. And I think these two things need to be sort of addressed all at the one time. And, sometimes these things get glossed over because they're uncomfortable discussions that nobody really wants to have. And everybody sort of wanted to walk away from the pandemic saying, well, look, didn't we do a great job? And didn't we manage to create this great fund, and didn't it boost the recovery for everybody who needed it? But that's not quite true, So I think there should probably be a little bit more reflection on what has happened to date, what lessons can be learned from it, and where there may be a requirement for own resources at EU level, which has been flagged but not really delivered on, and where it actually adds value. I mean, let's not do things for the sake of it. Let's actually ensure that there's a purpose to all of this and that it actually benefits ultimately European citizens. And I'm not sure that's been demonstrated yet. So, but that brings us to the kind of next multi-annual financial framework and the budgetary negotiations that are kicking off. And they are, I mean, it's exactly the same debate with exactly the same players as we had for the recent economic governance sort of argy-bargy. It'll be exactly the same positioning on the multi-annual financial framework. You'll have the wealthier countries and the net contributors wanting to pay less, and sort of being on the what traditionally was the UK perspective, and you'll have the others, particularly Central Eastern Europeans, who feel they haven't been getting a fair deal, and Southern European countries taking the opposite view. So there's a long way to go, but I think it would be great to see a little bit more self-reflection at EU level, and a little bit more critical appraisal of what has happened to date, and the lessons that can and should be learned from that, rather than sort of only a focus on the sins of member states.
And the one area that is being spoken of in terms of a particular project where common debt issuance could be used is in boosting the military industrial capacity of Europe. Clearly, the past 2 years have utterly changed the security environment in Europe. There's a record that we just are not prepared to protect ourselves particularly if Russia were to win in Ukraine, and that we simply need to rearm. This is prospect of that agenda moving forward, where there be common debt issuance to build up military industrial capacity?
I actually think that we're facing such an existential crisis that there probably won't be any alternative. We're looking at a more than probably Trump presidency, which I think hasn't really landed as a full realization amongst European leaders yet. I mean, in every permutation of every poll, Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States. I mean, things can change perhaps in the coming months, but I wouldn't bet my life on it. So Donald Trump will significantly, dramatically reduce, if not end, US funding of the military operation in Ukraine, and that means that somebody else is going to have to plug the gap, and it can't be just the United Kingdom, So the European Union is going to have to act, and I don't believe there'll be any choice. Of course, this presents a massive political issue for Ireland, because if pretty much every other member state is moving forward to contribute and to support the establishment of joint procurement and more for security and defence spending, primarily aimed at Ukraine. Ireland is going to be an exceptional outlier. You know, and it's back to that old debate about how we all benefit and piggyback on the security and defence arrangements paid for by others, and that we may have managed to go under the radar over the last couple of decades, but with the war on our border threatening fellow members of the European Union, I'm not sure that that'll be sustainable. So that's going to be a big debate, and Ireland is an outlier.
Stark. Conall, I'd like to ask you about your views on the efficacy of the Resilience Fund. And let me just make one point that Italy, which has been the big country that's been most, has had the worst growth performance this century, its investment spending, that includes private and public, has surged since the pandemic. It was stagnating or growing very slowly for 20 years. It's had a massive increase since the pandemic. Now, it's not clear yet whether that was caused by the pandemic, by the Resilience Fund, whether it will last, whether it was a sugar rush, but at least it's one sort of potential bright spot that could boost Italian productivity. But just having made that point, what's your overall assessment of the efficacy of the Resilience Fund in terms of boosting growth in Europe, particularly in the southern, weaker countries?
I suppose when you look at the numbers, the grants have been committed so far around just under 300 million, so around 2% of EU GDP. But I mean, that's going to be spread out a number of years. And Lucinda kind of mentioned that, you know, the money hasn't necessarily been spent yet. There's loans being given out, but again, government's been able to borrow and the ECB has been doing quantitative easing. So to what extent those loans have really helped is certainly arguable. So look, I mean, this is kind of 2% of GDP spread out over several years. It's certainly not the thing that's going to make or break. I suppose there's kind of been skepticism that the Recovery and Resilience Fund might follow, you know, a range of other initiatives from the EU, which kind of failed to really have an impact. You mentioned Italy there, and there's a debate, and I suppose some people are arguing that when it comes to reform of the judiciary, energy, water infrastructure, that there has been a positive impact. But then others still arguing that we're sort of channeling this money through bureaucracies that, you know, don't take risks and may not be too efficient in the way they allocate the capital. So again, it's very early. You know, this money's been spread out a number of years, and you know, I don't look at this in detail, but my day job is kind of look at kind of the swings of the economic cycle, and it's not something that people are debating as it's something that's really moving the dial when it comes to growth prospects. That's, you know, monetary policy, underlying trends of productivity, investment, population growth, which are much more difficult issues. And, you know, the Recovery Resilience Fund at best is kind of a marginal impact on investment and productivity, but maybe some straws in the wind that it's been a bit more successful in Italy than perhaps some of the cynics would have suggested.
Conall, the bond buying that took place during the European Central by the European Central Bank during the pandemic, it bought a lot of government bonds. There is a fear that as it reverses that and sells those bonds off, that this could cause instability or an outbreak of a financial crisis. Are you reasonably optimistic that that won't happen?
I don't think that's really a fear that we should really have in our minds. I mean, the central bank has kind of recently reformed its framework for doing monetary policy, and this is ahead of starting what it calls quantitative tightening, which is effectively selling bonds back into the market. Now, as you said, you know, back in the financial crisis, central banks put rates to zero and said, what can we do next? Which was to buy long-term bonds. So you would reduce long-term borrowing costs as well as short-term costs. And as it starts to sell those bonds and may see upward pressure on long-term yields, the central bank will be taking that into account, and it can always cut short-term rates more aggressively if it wants to continue doing that. And, you know, it has an overall monetary stance it wants to maintain. Now, the other part of this new framework is that there's going to be a permanent asset purchase facility, which the European Central Bank will have. And what's really underlying this is the idea that we're going to have a lot of excess liquidity in the banking system. We're not going to have a situation in which the interbank funding market comes back, and maybe banks in some countries would have to go to the interbank funding market for funding. The ECB is going to maintain this asset purchase portfolio, will still hold bonds. It will also still provide full funding at close to at its refinancing rate to banks who need it. So again, there's no sense in which, I remember when I was in the Bank of England, Mervyn King got a lot of criticism for what he called moral hazard and refusing to kind of guarantee funding to UK banks, which clearly needed it in 2009 and 2010. If you look at the ECB's new framework, as it reduces that excess liquidity, sells bonds, it's promising that it's going to be there for banks should they need that funding and as it withdraws that liquidity from the system. So, I think there's something very cognizant of. They're certainly not going to cause a crisis as they start to do this over the next couple of years.
Okay, Lucinda, to come back to you on your point about trade. Well, you made the point about the return of Donald Trump and the security implications for Europe. He's also promised to impose a 10% tariff on all goods that come into the United States. Last year, Ireland exported goods worth 50 billion to the United States. That was more than France, a country that's more than 10 times, economy that's more than 10 times bigger. We are by far the biggest per capita exporter of goods in. So my question is, how would you anticipate the reaction of the European Commission, which of course is exclusive competence in trade, if US were to impose 10% tariffs across the board on everything from Europe? What sort of response do you think there would be from Europe? And then we can maybe follow on, does that end up in sort of a tit for tat thing that really damages us? Or what if even if it stops there, what sort of damage do you think that could cause for Ireland?
Significant, I would say, to answer sort of in short. I think, I believe this is going to be a very different Trump presidency in that he has the experience behind him now. He knows what he can do. He knows the boundaries, and well, insofar as Donald Trump respects boundaries, he understands where he has capacity to take decisions, to issue executive orders and so on. And I think he will have very little concern for diplomacy, for what anybody really around him has to say. Certainly nobody will stop him if he decides to proceed with 10% tariffs, export controls, that type of thing. I think really probably the only way to engage with Trump is to sort of have a proposition which is more appealing. And probably the only way in which that can be achieved by the European Union will be relating to China. So, in the United States, the only political issue on which there is bipartisan agreement is China. Despite Trump's early day attempts in his last mandate to cozy up to the Chinese, I think he realized very quickly that as much as he's famous for double crossing people, the Chinese regime is even more capable. So I think that and it is a different world, after COVID and after the experience around supply chain disruption and supply chain dependencies. That's something that he can and could understand. So I think the European Union will need to be really careful in terms of who they choose as trade commissioner. Somebody who's political and a deal maker like Phil Hogan on the last occasion was actually a good choice during the Trump presidency, although we better not mention that war. I think it needs to be somebody of that sort of stature again, somebody who knows how politics works and who can understand how to engage with Trump. And obviously the next president of the European Commission is also going to be very important in that context, because that is the personal bilateral interlocutor, that the president of the United States will be engaging with directly. So they're important appointments that I hope European decision makers will be factoring in as they carve up these positions in the coming months. But Trump, ultimately, and this is the consensus of everybody who knows him, who's observed him politically at close quarters in the US, like Trump will do what he wants to do unless there's a better reason not to do it. And I think that's got to be the approach of the EU. We could very easily end up in a retaliatory, as we saw the last time with the EU imposing tariffs on strategically important export goods, particularly in the agri-food sector and others. But who wins from that? Absolutely nobody. We're supposed to espouse a liberal economic model. We're supposed to advocate an integrated transatlantic partnership. And actually, it's never been more important than it is now, not just in the context of Ukraine, but also in the context of de-risking from China, which is happening anyway. So I think there's going to have to be some real effort from the European Union to be strategic and to know who they're dealing with, and try to psychologically understand who it is, because it will be him. It's not like in a normal administration where it'd be the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Commerce, and it will be him, and anybody who stands in his way will be sacked. So it's really important that the EU understands that, and all Ireland can do really is try and maintain those relationships. He likes Ireland, that's good. But as you say, this is the sole competence of the European Union, so we need to be at the table advocating. And frankly, Ireland is woefully under-resourced in Brussels for these types of big tasks. I mean, we have one or two attaches working on these big existential questions, and that's just not good enough in the post-Brexit environment. We don't have the UK to do our bidding anymore, and we need to wake up to that fact.
And you mentioned that we need to be strategic. So DG Trade will do the standard thing. It has a lot of power, it's a lot of clout, it's one of the big trading blocks. The standard thing is that you have to retaliate. If somebody takes a measure against you, you have to retaliate. In this case, given the security dimension, is it possible that the strategic answer to Trump's tariffs would be, let's not antagonize it? In this instance, we're just going to suck it up over Ukraine, rather than provoke, particularly as I've heard some people suggest, that he will link the security aspect to the trade aspect. And if Europe wants to hit America back, then that will be connected to the security dimension. And that the strategic hard choice we might have to make is actually just suck up these tariffs, not retaliate. Do you see that as a possibility?
I don't actually. Now, he hasn't said a huge, there have been some hints from his team that he hasn't said a huge amount on that. I mean, what he has said, I mean, in terms of linking the economic trade dimension with Ukraine, but what he has said repeatedly is he's gonna do business with Putin. He's gonna arrive at a settlement. It'll be, Crimea plus. Here you go, Vladimir, and now we have peace. I'm a great peacemaker, and if Europe wants to do anything else in terms of dealing with Vladimir Putin, well, Europe can pay for that itself. And I really believe that's what he's going to do. I don't think Donald Trump is going to fund the war in Ukraine. I mean, I think the tap will be turned off. So that's challenge number one for Europe, as we discussed earlier, in terms of how they're going to fund that, or how we are going to fund that collectively, including Ireland. And then the second piece is, does he link that to the tariff issue? I actually don't think he will. I think he'll be. I mean, he looks at that like a business transaction, and for him, it's about supporting. Buy American, support American, etc., supporting American industry, America first, and that is going to be his key mantra. So he's gonna push to one side foreign policy issues because he's not interested. It's unpopular with his voter base. Nobody wants to spend money on Ukraine. They can't see the benefit for America. That's just the simplistic voter view in the US, but that's the view. So that's his view. And he's so notoriously populist. And then when it comes to the trade war issues, I think it's kind of a separate conversation, and it's about Europe showing that actually Europe and the US have got to do this together, have got to join forces to immobilize China to an extent, and to ensure that we can continue to grow our economies collectively. And I think there is a case to be made that Trump could understand, but it's got to be the right people making it, and they've got to be able to pitch it in a way that is appealing to him, and all he thinks about is America first. That's all. That is going to be his guiding principle for the next 4 years. So that's all he cares about. So how do we make it clear that you can't build the chips in America, that are required by Intel or whoever, without components from Europe. Plus, I mean, it's de-risking from China isn't just about Europe, but about the integrated supply chains across the globe minus China. And how do you demonstrate that you've got that they need parts for car manufacturing in the US that we can only provide in Europe, and vice versa. So therefore, it'll hurt you, Donald, and it'll hurt your voters if you impose these tariffs, because we will have to retaliate, and we don't want that. So that's going to be, I think, the sort of nature of the dialogue.
Conall, from an Irish economy perspective, a 10% tariff on the 50 billion of exports that we ship across the Atlantic to the United States, how big an impact do you think that could have on the Irish economy? And as Lucinda says, if there's retaliation, there are import taxes for stuff that comes from the United States into Ireland. That's a second round effect. To what extent should we be worried about in Ireland about this possible transatlantic disintegration?
Well, look, I don't understand as if I'm kind of being too eager to seeing this as too benign, but I mean, of that 50 billion, 41 billion of it is pharmaceuticals. And for the most part, Trump is it's offshoring from the United States, which is concerned the Republican Party and Donald Trump. And for the most part, multinationals in Ireland are here to service the EU market. We send more pharmaceuticals to the EU than we do to the United States. But, it is possible that where there are tariffs there, that, you can imagine the employment of some of those pharmaceutical companies could be quite limited. If there's tariffs there, it might be possible for those pharmaceutical companies to reorientate production to avoid the tariffs. But look, we're not a small open economy. Anything that's relates to the breakdown of trade, it clearly isn't positive. But our multinational sectors in pharmaceuticals, ICT, agri-food, they tend to be defensive, which means they're not less cyclical. But also, people continue to get sick. Tariffs or not, they need to get those pharmaceuticals. So you tend to see the price increases pass through. So I'd be hopeful, but look, we're a very open economy exposed to multinationals. Who knows? Maybe corporate tax could come into this as well. Not good. I should also say just one point in terms of Trump's tariffs. I mean, you can get a little bit too overly focused on Donald Trump. Earlier this month, the Biden administration decided to stick with the tariffs Trump brought in and actually added in some extra ones on lithium batteries. If you look at the EU, they actually have a review of EV cars and batteries as well. I suppose one of the kind of interesting examples I saw was solar panels. So the International Energy Agency estimate that 80% of the world's capacity for solar panel production is in China. So if we're going to take climate change seriously, we have to kind of just reconcile ourselves to that. There's been a slightly odd issue in the United States where they put up very large tariffs on imports of solar panels from China. Now they're coming from other countries like Vietnam and Malaysia, even though the capacity ultimately is in China. So there seems to be a bit of a rerouting around the tariffs at the moment. But I mean, the EU is considering this issue with EV cars and solar panels and batteries. Do we really want to put up tariffs in China? If we're going to take climate change seriously, do we have the capacity to, build these things ourselves in Europe? So, when we have these issues around climate change and this sort of new wave of industrial policy, the climate change seems to be taking a bit of a back seat, whereas people are getting very exercised about fair competition and security of supply chains. So I think that is concerning.
Okay, look, you raised further issues there about trade policy in relation to environmental impact in China. Wanted to come to those, but we're right up at the end of the session. But I'd like to thank Lucinda and Conall for really good contributions. I think there was a lot of stuff teased out there, and hopefully food for thought for everyone. So thank you both for joining us, and thank you to everyone who joined us over the course of the session. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.